Imagine a world where nearly half the population vanishes in just a few years. It sounds like science fiction, but this was the grim reality of the 14th century. We've all heard of the Black Death, the terrifying plague that swept across Europe, Asia, and Africa. We picture the overflowing carts, the masked doctors, and the sheer terror. But what if I told you that beyond the unimaginable loss, this catastrophe became one of the most powerful catalysts for change in human history? What if the end of the world as they knew it was actually the beginning of our modern one? Today, we're not just looking at the tragedy of the Black Death, we're uncovering its unseen legacy, the profound and often surprising ways it reshaped society, economics, religion, and even our own DNA, ultimately paving the way for the Renaissance and the world we live in today. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-1300s. Europe is operating under a rigid feudal system. You have lords, vassals, and at the very bottom, a massive population of serfs. These serfs were essentially tied to the land they worked. They had few rights, little pay, and almost no chance of changing their station in life. The lord owned the land, and by extension, he owned their labor. It was a system that had been in place for centuries, seemingly unbreakable. The church was the ultimate authority, its doctrines woven into the fabric of daily life, explaining everything from the harvest to personal misfortune. Life was predictable, harsh, and, for most, unchanging. Then the rats came, and with them the fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The devastation was swift and merciless. From 1347 to 1351, the Black Death carved a path of destruction, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Entire villages were erased from the map. Cities like Florence and Venice lost over half their citizens. The psychological toll was immense. People believed it was the wrath of God, the literal apocalypse. But amidst this chaos, a strange and unexpected new reality began to emerge. Suddenly, the most abundant resource in the medieval world, people, had become incredibly scarce. And this is where our story of transformation begins. Think about it from the perspective of a surviving peasant. Before the plague, you were one of many, easily replaceable. Your lord could demand anything, and you had no choice but to comply. But now, the fields were empty, the harvests were rotting, the lords were desperate. For the first time in centuries, the power dynamic began to shift. Labor was now a valuable commodity. Surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in an unheard-of position of bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. If one lord refused, they could simply pack up and go to the next estate, where someone would gladly pay for their help. This was revolutionary. This newfound power led to what historians call the Golden Age of the European laborer. Wages in some parts of Europe doubled, even tripled. For the first time, common people could afford better food, better clothing, and even save a little money. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to dissolve. Many peasants were able to buy their freedom or negotiate their way out of feudal obligations. This massive social upheaval is known as the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Although it was brutally suppressed, the message was clear. The old order was crumbling, and the common person would no longer be silent. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it mortally wounded the feudal system itself. The economic shockwaves didn't stop there. With fewer people, there was a surplus of goods and land. The price of land plummeted, while the price of labor skyrocketed. This forced landowners to get creative. They had to find more efficient ways to work their land with fewer people. This spurred innovation in agriculture. We see the increased use of labor-saving devices like the heavy plow and water mills. Land that was once used for grain was converted to pasture for sheep, as raising livestock required far fewer workers. This shift towards sheep farming fueled the growing textile industry, which would become a cornerstone of the future European economy. Essentially, the plague forced a transition from a labor-intensive economy to one that valued efficiency and technology. Simultaneously, a crisis of faith was brewing. Before the plague, the church held almost absolute spiritual authority. People prayed, they fasted, they went on pilgrimages, believing their devotion would protect them. But the plague was indiscriminate. It struck down the pious and the sinner, the priest and the peasant, alike. Prayers went unanswered. The church, which was supposed to be the conduit to God, seemed powerless. Many high-ranking clergy members died, and they were often replaced by less educated, less experienced individuals, which further eroded the church's prestige. This disillusionment pushed people in two different directions. Some became even more intensely devout, turning to radical, mystical forms of worship, like the flagellants who publicly whipped themselves as penance. Others, however, began to question the church's authority. A new wave of secular thought started to bubble up. People began looking for answers not just in Scripture, but in the world around them, in reason, in observation, in humanity itself. This intellectual shift was a crucial seed for the humanism movement that would define the Renaissance. People started to focus more on life on Earth rather than solely on the afterlife. And this brings us to the Renaissance. It's no coincidence that this explosion of art, science, and culture began in Italy just a few generations after the Black Death. The plague had shaken up society in all the right ways. The new wealth accumulated by merchants and even some skilled laborers created a new class of patrons who could fund art and architecture. The focus shifted from the purely divine to celebrating human potential and achievement. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci studied human anatomy with a new scientific rigor, a practice that would have been unthinkable before the plague's disruption. The intellectual curiosity that the plague ignited, combined with the new economic realities, created the perfect environment for the Renaissance to flourish. The legacy of the Black Death is even written into our biology. Recent scientific studies have found that descendants of plague survivors may carry specific genetic mutations. One study identified a gene variant that made people more likely to survive the plague, but this same variant is linked to a higher risk of autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease today. It's a stunning example of how a historical event can have a lasting impact on our very genetic makeup, shaping our health and vulnerabilities centuries later. So, when we look back at the Black Death, we must see it as more than just a horrifying pandemic. It was a reset button for an entire continent. It dismantled a rigid social structure, empowered the common person, sparked economic innovation, challenged religious authority, and ultimately cleared the ground for the intellectual and cultural blossoming of the Renaissance. The world that emerged from the ashes of the plague was one of greater social mobility, economic dynamism, and intellectual freedom. It was a world that was undeniably more modern. It's a powerful, if somber, reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations in human civilization are born from the deepest crises. The echoes of this 14th century catastrophe can still be felt today, in our economies, our institutions, and even in our own bodies. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this exploration of the Black Death's hidden legacy as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new video. See you next time.